Welcome to this episode of Trash Compactor, where I will be making a Rebel Fleet Trooper. To make a Rebel Fleet Trooper, you'll need a Power of the Force version. As you can see, I've got one here. Not very attractive figures. He's got the overinflated body and the very weird stance. As you can see, he's got the He-Man chest. The waistcoat may come in handy, but mainly with this guy, won't be using his body. It will literally be a case of chopping off his head and helmet and applying to another figure. So for the body of my Rebel Fleet Trooper, I'm going to be using a beta figure, and here is a Bespin Solo as an example. He is a very beaten up figure, very well played with. You can see he's got a lot of wearing, his joints are very loose. He has seen better days. He has done what he was meant to do, was played with and gave someone loads of pleasure, but not really suitable for a display. So using this figure, I'm going to be taking parts of him and adding him to this beaten up Endor Han. Doesn't look in too bad condition, but he's got sort of issues when it comes to standing and his joints. So what I'm going to do is pop Han into a cup of boiling water. Probably not the first time Han's been in hot water. Just move that out of the way, and we're going to leave Han to soak for 3 to 4 minutes just to soften up his parts. So I'm just going to remove Han from the water and give him a dry off with a towel, and now it's a case of gently pulling on his head to pop him off the spike joint. So Endor Han has a spike joint. This will come in very handy in a short moment when we put the head on from the Power of the Force figure. Heads usually come in two types. Bespin Han has a peg head, so the head goes into the body, where I know that Endor Han has got the spike, so hence why I'm using his body. So we'll merge these two together and take his head and we'll get it and put it on Han's body. The heads are very stiff on the Power of the Force figures, as these are usually on a peg joint which goes into the body. So if you wanted to remove the head and get the peg, then the best thing to do is to pop it in boiling water in the same way we did with Endor Han, and then you can prise his head off and the peg system will come out of the body with a bit of effort. Sometimes it can snap, so be very careful, but for this figure we don't actually need to worry about his head because we're going to be chopping it off with a scalpel. Just one of the things to note though is that with these figures the helmet tends to be held on with a little bit of glue. So I've popped him in the hot water to try and loosen the glue, and then give him a little bit of a dry off, prise off his helmet very gently, and eventually it will pop off and fly across the room. So now I've retrieved his helmet. You can see it's on a little peg system with a hole in it that goes into the head of the Power of the Force 2 figure. Clean off any glue that you find, give it a bit of a clean up. So we're going to be cutting off his head now in prep to join the Endor Han body. So with a scalpel, be really careful and just cut below the actual neck seam where the peg goes into the body. We're not going to need the body, so don't worry, just try not to damage the head. So you can see the head's come off. What we need to do is give that a little bit of trim, neaten it up to flatten down the neck so it will sit better when we drill the hole ready to go on Han's body. So what we're going to do with the head, that will be drilled through and that will go onto the peg, and the peg will go through replacing the peg that already existed. And the helmet will sit nicely on the peg joint and will hold the head in place, so it will work and look quite seamless, and will start to look like a vintage figure in a moment. So using my Dremel tool, I'm going to use a very low speed grinding with a grinding tool. The reason why I do it at low speed is I just have a little bit more control and I can slowly grind through the plastic, moving any bits of plastic off to make a nice clear hole. So now I'm through the main head. You can see we've gone straight through. Changed over my grinding tool to one with a flat end that's even all the way through, and on a low speed again, just going to file through and make that hole nice and neat. So now we've got the hole drilled, we can now pop the head on. Pop it onto Han's body, give it a bit of a tight push. As you can see, there's a little ridge on there. Push the head tightly on, go on with a bit of a push, and there you go, head will be on. Give it a few twists just to settle it down. Won't come off without some effort. There we are, a few twists just to settle it down, and that'll be nice and flat against the body. Then you can get the helmet, pop the helmet on, back in the square, and that will fit nicely on the peg. And as you can see, already starting to take shape. Head turns quite nicely. There we are, nearly got a Rebel Fleet Trooper. Only thing is, he's the wrong colour. We need to paint him. Before I start painting him, I'm going to make him a custom weapon. So I've got some repo weapons off eBay. Please never ever use genuine weapons. They're a rarity. They always got lost when we were kids. So they're like gold dust. Treat them with the respect they deserve. So only ever buy repo weapons for any custom projects that you're doing. So I got these for a few pound off eBay. I got some hand blasters and some Bespin blasters. And what I'm going to do is merge them into one weapon. So they look a little bit more like the gun that the Fleet Trooper had in the film. Take the hand blaster, cut the grip, the bottom part off. So basically we're creating a sight. Which is always very fiddly. That will give us the sight. Then what we'll do is, from that, it's a bit too long, I'm just going to trim a little bit off there just to neaten it up, to make it nice and flat for when we glue it. And then I'm also going to chop a little bit of the length off the original barrel, just so it looks more like a sight rather than a gun on top of a gun. So using my Stanley knife, just going to chop through. And there we have a telescopic sight which will go on top of the Bespin blaster. The Bespin blaster's got a couple of ridges, so you just need to trim those off. So now I've trimmed those pieces off, I'm going to grab a piece of blue tack, one of my favourite tools for holding things, and I will stick the Bespin blaster into the blue tack. That will hold it nice and firm. And then get some super glue, any brand will do. Stick a little bit on top of the blaster. And then I'll get the part we took off the hand blaster, the scope, and then we'll glue that, stick that onto the top of the indoor blaster. Making sure it's nice and straight and even. There we are. There we are, the weapon's starting to come together. I'll make a few of those and then we'll come back to them later and we'll give it a quick splodge with some paint, and that will create the effect of the blaster for the Rebel Fleet Trooper. So I've made a couple of Rebel Fleet Troopers. This is just to show you how you can change their feet. When they stand, they can be a little bit precarious with the way the legs have spread, especially with the Endor Han. So I'm going to pop one in boiling water just to soften the plastic, and then actually remodel his legs so they are closer together. I'll pop them both in so they both soften, and we'll only apply it to one so you can see what happens to the legs as they fall into their natural position. So a few minutes has passed, take the figures out, give them a dry off normally, but they're not too wet, so it's fine. And then you can see how flexible the plastic becomes. So at this point, while it's still soft and pliable, I'm going to get a cable tie and then loop that around his feet. Just move the cup out of the way to make it easier. So I put the cable tie around his feet and tighten it. And what this will do is keep his feet together and mould them into a straighter position. So a little bit more together, looking a little more rigid. Now I can leave him to cool down naturally, or one of the good things to do is to snip off the plastic end of the cable tie and then pop him in some hot water and leave him to cool down naturally. I'll leave that one as it is so you can see the difference between the two, and then we can do a comparison afterwards. So I've taken my Rebel Fleet Trooper out of the water, and as you can see I've still got the cable tie on his feet. All I need to do now is to snip that off. Now he's cooled down. His legs will open just a little bit as it falls in naturally. We go, but you can see a lot more straighter. His feet are together, stands up better. And if you compare that to the other Fleet Trooper, you can sort of see roughly how far apart the difference are in the legs and how much better they stand. This guy's determined not to stand up. There we are, just a different angle to show them. So there's a natural hand position. The one in the middle is the one that I've changed the angle of the feet. And again, the one on the right is natural indoor hand. So by doing that with the feet, you can just make them look a little bit different from the figures' bodies that they came from. You could do more. You could make it look a bit more like this guy. We could pad up his waistcoat using milli putty or something. This is one of the more the legend figures, I believe, sort of the anniversary figures they made with bendable knees and legs and feet. So you can put them in lots of strange positions. Great if you want them to be sat down in a diorama or something, but I'm not a huge fan. I just think they look unnatural. So now we've got our figure, he's dried. I'm going to paint one of my Rebel Fleet Troopers. So I've taken his helmet off. I'm going to use little plastic tubs to mix my paint in. Always good to mix your paints in something that you can reseal, so if you make too much you're not going to waste it and you can stick a lid on. However, I do have some pre-mixed paint which was from a previous project. However, I ended up buying some and it ended up being exactly the same shade as Matte 65, which is an acrylic paint. So I always use acrylics to paint my Star Wars figures. So you could use the pre-bought one, or you could use one you mixed if you prefer a shade. You want it to be more blue, more grey, it's entirely up to you. So I'm going to use the one I've pre-mixed because I quite like the colour and it's sort of in keeping with the film and the way they exaggerated the colours on some of the figures. I'm going to start painting, making sure I've got some really nice fine brushes. And I'll speed these parts of the video up rather than you sitting and watching me painting figures. So I use nice sharp brushes so I can get into the detail, paint the figures with a nice fine brush. Always make sure you don't have too much paint on your brush. That's what's handy about having the little pot next to you. And it's just a case of filling in the areas you want to paint. While you're painting, if you do make any slips or spills, or you do paint over a piece, you can go back on later and paint over it in a different colour. As you can see during this, I actually painted a collar on. It wasn't until I got to the end that I realised I didn't like it, so later on in the video I do actually paint over it with black. You could sculpt a collar in milli putty, which I'll probably do in another video one day, but for the moment this one will have his collar painted over in a short while. So I'm going to now do his trousers and I'm going to mix the paint. So I don't have a grey which I feel matches the colour that I want, so I want to go for something similar to the figure on the left. So just going to mix my white paint and my black paint together, which is a mixture of a matte white and a gloss black, so it sort of gives me a little bit of a dull shine but isn't too shiny. So once I've got my paint mixed, it's just a case then of painting the figure. Again, when you're painting, don't apply too much paint. You can do 2 coats. It's good to keep a nice thin coat, but the good thing about these is sometimes the less you go over a spot, the less likely you are to need to keep painting. It's quite good just to get a coat on, and then if it doesn't dry evenly you can touch up those parts which look like they need it rather than adding a second coat. Keeps the detail of the figure. And when you're painting all the joints, it's just a case of moving the legs around to get into those gaps. And if you do get any gaps later on, you can fill them. So he's basically painted. I'm just going to touch up a few little bits there. And it's now a case just leaving him to dry off for a little while. Probably takes half an hour if that. Once he's dry, I can then start working on further detail, touching up any bits where I've actually gone over the lines, made any smudges. Again, I said about his collar, wasn't keen on that, so I'm going to paint over that. But before I do that, I'm going to do his holster using this brown matte 65 paint. So with a super fine brush, and fill them in very, very carefully. So there we are, I've painted his holster. Just going to give him 30 or so minutes to dry off so it's completely dry, and then I can go back and make any small touch-ups. So he's dried off now, so what I'm going to do is touch up the black areas of the figure, such as his boots and his waistcoat, and remove that collar that I painted on earlier, as I just don't think it looks right. It might look good on the video, but it just doesn't look right on the actual figure. So there we are, I've painted his waistcoat, touched up the collar, painted his boots. Just going to leave him to dry off for a little bit now, making sure I don't smudge any of his paint. Usually a good way of doing this is bending his arms back or forwards and leaning him to rest on his hands. This gives me an opportunity just to touch up a couple of bits at the back on his boots. So he's dried off now, as you can see. Nice shiny waistcoat, nice shiny boots. His holster's painted. What I need to do now is add the metal detail onto his belt. So I'm going to use one of these pens that has a silver paint in it. It's quite good for making small details for insignia and badges. And I just colour in the raised buckle there. I can do the same on his belt buckle. And then turn him over and do the belt buckle on the back. And the Fleet Trooper is nearly coming together. Finishing touches. So I'm going to leave him to dry off now. So now he's dried, we can actually get his helmet, pop it into the square hole onto the peg, give it a nice gentle push down. If you wanted, you could change the colour of his hair, paint it grey or yellow, make him blonde, paint his eyebrows. I'm quite happy with his face the way it is. There we are, we have our Rebel Fleet Trooper painted and done. And I'll put him next to the previous one before it's painted, just so you can see a before and after. So the only thing he's missing now is his blaster. So the next thing is, now the guns have dried, you can see I've made 3 here, all working quite well. Just a case now of giving them a slight touch up with some paint. So as you remember, I made them from a Bestmin blaster and the chopped off top from a hand blaster. So I'll grab some black gloss paint, give these a quick touch up, give them a good covering, let it all soak in, doesn't matter if you get on the tweezers. Just got to be careful not to drop it. I'm going to grab a sponge, just put the gun onto the sponge, give it a slight press, get the excess paint off, it'll still keep its shape and colour. And grab a smaller sponge, just give it a bit of a dab, take the excess paint off, bob it somewhere to dry. So once it's all dried, it's just a case of giving the blaster to your Rebel Fleet Trooper, and hey presto, he's done. Comparison again of the two, just so you can see the difference. So I'm going to carry on and make myself a small army. And there we go, we have our finished Rebel Fleet Trooper with unique blaster. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see more, then please do subscribe if you want to see what's coming up in the future. And if you have any suggestions for future figures, then by all means drop me a line.